So, Diamond and Pearl launched on September 28, 2006, and while Game Freak still had to roll out Platinum, the Gen 2 remakes, and juggle localization dates, they had almost 4 years of prep time for Generation 5, which was a lot for the DS era, especially considering recent generations now have less development time despite being way more technically demanding. And if you saw the Diamond and Pearl deep dive, you'll know Game Freak poured everything into Gen 4 to try and make the ultimate Pokemon experience at the time. Thus, Gen 5 became the grounds for a philosophical reboot of a series. First overseas-based region, strictly new Pokemon, a big push towards storytelling, and overall just a fresh experience. It was a bold time for Pokemon, and thanks to the Terra leak, we now have access to hundreds, if not thousands of beta builds from this really strange experimental era. And now I've created a full timeline for it. Huge shout out to The Bomb, I couldn't have made this video without you, and MD Travis, the legend who compiled a ton of the builds that I'll be talking about. Before we dive in, if you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to keep up with all of my latest uploads. So according to the compiler himself, MD Travis, the Black and White repo dates back to late 2006. And sure, while Gen 5 wasn't Game Freak's main focus at the time, the build surfaced as far back as here. Seeing as though this was just weeks after Diamond and Pearl had released, most of the team were probably busy prepping for Platinum and the Gen 2 remakes, while a very small group were assigned to the Gen 5 project, building out tech demos for the next year and a half. In the middle of this tech demo phase, we have May 6, 2007. This is called the Dungeon Tech Demo. It's basically just a character running around a 3D maze. Most notably, the player character is a 3D model of May. Now it's unclear if this specific demo was made in-house by Game Freak, or if it was sourced from another engine, but the presence of May as a playable model strongly suggests they were experimenting with breaking out of 2D sprites. Over 6 years before X and Y released. Honestly, the model itself deserves a spotlight. I think it looks great, and it's the closest we have to translating the classic Pokemon sprites and proportions into 3D. Even just watching it run around, you can see the vision. The potential is there. Fast forward a week, and now May has a hammer and a bow. You can swap between them too. I assume this was for testing object handling or equipment mechanics, maybe as a precursor to item-based overworld puzzles. Not sure how it would have translated to Pokemon gameplay though. The next day, the build featured a tech demo for a cancelled remake of Yoshi No Tamago, a puzzle game from the Super Nintendo. This remake never released, there's no record of its development, and this early Black and White build is the only trace of its existence. For the rest of 2007, it was mostly just tech demo tinkering. As I mentioned, the main dev team was locked into Platinum and the Gen 2 remakes. But we do know that Black and White were officially pitched on April 13th, 2007. If you haven't watched my Black and White deep dive yet, I highly recommend checking it out after this. But a quick recap, the pitch doc outlined how Gen 5 were already planning to base the region on New York. Many of the game's pitched features were also very ambitious. Skipping ahead to April 1st, 2008, the tinkering phase is officially over, and it's a special day, because it marks the official start of program development for Pokémon Black and White, just under a year after the pitch. This build features a more evolved version of the Dungeon Tech demo. May has been replaced with a completely different model. The character has realistic proportions, tall frame, longer limbs. It honestly feels less like Pokemon and more like a random 3DS prototype. Except this is still running on the Nintendo DS, like you could boot this on your DS Lite. While I'm conflicted on this topic, and I doubt Game Freak ever truly planned to go this direction for Gen 5, the demo shows that they were pushing the limits, even just as an internal benchmark. The same build included a 3-dimensional Tetris puzzle demo. Then, just 2 days later, the dungeon demo had evolved even further. The character model is way more detailed, and you can now switch between multiple outfits. The screen has visible toggles and options that affect gameplay, and most bizarrely, roaming Charizard models start appearing. Game Freak was actively pushing the DS hardware. Black and White didn't even have any 3D models of Pokemon, besides in the opening and the legendary cutscenes. You see this character jumping around too, and quickly it feels like Pokemon was heading in a completely different direction. A day later it escalates. Now there's an entire squad of giant Charizards surrounding the player. It's a pretty surreal experience honestly. But again, this is just benchmark testing the engine. Then we get to April 13. The demo now features a wide flat test map, with tons of Pokemon NPCs running around, and those giant Charizards are still here. What's interesting is that the player character is invisible, and even more notably, the NPCs aren't gridlocked anymore. I think it's worth highlighting the fact that at this point, it's clear that Game Freak wasn't just building on top of a Gen 4 engine. You'd assume they just took the Gen 4 framework and built on top of it. But no, this is all Generation 5 was in April 2008, a completely new foundation, where the focus was on reinventing the engine and redefining what a Pokemon game could be. Moving along a few months, we get to the August 8th build, one of the most legendary builds in the entire development timeline. This is the open world tech demo I've talked about before, a hugely ambitious, sandbox-style Pokemon build. The camera is fully rotatable, and there's no grid system at all. It's the most open we've ever seen 2D Pokemon. NPCs scattered across the map. The whole concept shows just how much potential Pokemon has in this genre. This was their what if moment. And here's the full map of a scenario. Also worth noting, the Heart Gold protagonist sprite appears here, even though that game wouldn't release for another year. Fast forward to November 28, and this build features multiple testing scenarios. And now there's clearly more Heart Gold influence. As you can see, the open concept was placed inside Violet City, using assets from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Honestly speaking, this is probably the cleanest, most realistic version of the 2D open world idea, and it feels like the final form of that original dungeon tech demo. I would love to play a Pokemon game in this style. Another scenario puts the player in Celestic Town, but the gameplay was touchscreen based and designed only for the bottom screen, which might sound odd, but many early DS games did often prioritize the touchscreen for primary gameplay. It was even a concept explored for Diamond and Pearl. What's interesting here is that double tapping the screen actually makes the character jump, a feature we've never seen in mainline Pokemon games, and it's a pretty big deal, because adding a jump mechanic drastically changes the gameplay framework of Pokemon, especially tied with those early open world concepts. It could have completely changed how Pokemon played. The next scenario was the earliest draft of Sky Arrow Bridge, which is in fact the earliest piece of anything Unova created in-game. And the last scenario was a prototype Gen 5 battle scene, which was surprisingly close to the final version, considering how early on this was. Also, the camera could move around, which might seem like a testing feature, but then the Pokemon sprites would react depending on where the camera was. There was also a graphic supposed to represent trainer info. Overall, a nice presentation of a battle. And finally, the battle features two completely unused Pokemon designs. Not even placeholder designs. These feel like genuine thought out designs that were cut at some point. Then we move into December 2008, where we see the earliest work on the actual Unova map. This right here is a very early version of Route 1. And one thing that immediately stands out is the scale. It's surprisingly huge, almost reminiscent of Johto's Route 30, though the layout is completely different. Heading into Accumula town, you can see two separate paths leading in the same direction, again hinting at just how expansive Route 1 originally was. And here's what Accumula town looked like. Right away there's some graffiti in the lower part of a map. The signpost to the right was missing, instead some red trees in its place. The Pokemon Center was absent, just Pikachu graffiti where it would eventually be. One especially interesting detail is the southwest exit, which originally led to another area with tall grass. In the final game, this whole section is completely closed off. Also, no tunnel transition into Route 2, just a seamless overworld connection. Route 2 itself had a completely different structure. I noticed just how much larger and more ambitious early Unova routes felt, especially compared to the final game. Route 2 hadn't been fully developed yet. The northern part was utilized as a testing area. Notably, it includes the first Gen 5 Pokemon Center appearance. The interior was also different. You can also visibly see the lower level, a nice detail that kind of carries over to the final version. Jumping into January 2009, one scenario in the build appears to test 3D camera movement in an unidentified location. Considering how this feature remains in the final game's files, it really seems like free camera control was still being considered very late into production, something we wouldn't see in a mainline game until Sword and Shield. Also a small detail, the trees were updated from the last build. By February 1st, we start to see some major overworld changes. We begin once again in Accumula town, now featuring a tunnel leading south, which wasn't in the final game, more NPCs wandering around, and the Pokemon Center is finally in its proper place. The interior remains the same as before. Heading west into Route 2, the layout stays largely consistent with a previous version, but now features updated graphics. Notably, the art style here is super unique, almost like a blend of Generation 4 and 5's aesthetics. Here's some gameplay of a route itself. Interestingly, the trainer card UI is literally just a placeholder from Beta Heart Gold. The battle scenario in this build also includes a really expressive animation for the opposing Pokemon, and the move screen is extremely bare. Again, not built on top of Gen 4, and clearly built from scratch. There's even an option to play around with a fixed camera angle. And finally, this build also includes a winter map, showing how they were already experimenting with seasonal environments. Then on the February 5th build, we get a brief glimpse of the earliest version of Castelia City. Just a single snapshot, but still significant. Moving along further to May 27, development had clearly ramped up. This build introduces a fully designed and textured New Vema town, along with a first proper Generation 5 style sprites. Despite New Vema looking close to the final version, the interiors were noticeably smaller, which made me realize how spacious Gen 5 interiors ended up being. I feel like the upper floor in the player's house was even more compact than older games. We also get a look at the beta version of a dialogue text box. The professor's lab had some small visual differences, but the overall layout remained mostly unchanged. This random NPC seems to be standing in as a placeholder for the professor. Heading back into Route 1, this version feels slightly different, and I actually think it's even larger, especially based on this area near the north. We also see an update to the trainer animation, now properly aligned with Gen 5 style. Returning to Accumula town, the layout has been cleaned up quite a bit. The stairs now match their position in the final game, but overall, the town still feels smaller than its final iteration. Route 2 also got an update, but it cuts off earlier than you'd expect. Just a couple days later, May 31st had this musical cutscene where various Pokemon are shown dancing, clearly a prototype of Pokemon musicals. This build also gives us our first glimpse at the bottom screen UI. It's still early, but the basic structure is starting to take shape. And here's a look at some general gameplay. The Pokemon Center interior had also been fully designed by this point, now very close to the final look. It was actually much smaller in this build. The final version ended up extending the space significantly. Also, the color scheme was quite different. Route 2's graphics got another update, now looking much closer to the final version in terms of tiles and visuals, but the layout was still completely different. Striaton City made its first appearance here as well, but at this point, it was filled with placeholder Pokemon Center buildings. And here's how the area towards the west looked. By June 4th, the focus had clearly shifted. At this stage, Game Freak had a solid gameplay foundation for the early towns and routes, so the attention turned towards visual polish, refining the art style and finalizing how Generation 5 would look. Notably, this build also includes the first appearance of an unused Pokemon design and the earliest rendition of a Dreamyard music. Strangely, when you return to Striaton City, the town appears fully textured. By August 7th, Game Freak had made some notable improvements to the overall presentation, with various visual upgrades starting to take shape. One detail I personally love is how the doors now have a glowing effect. The interiors were also updated, now feeling much more spacious and closer to the layouts we see in the final game. Though the player's house still had a few oddities. I believe this scene was meant to represent the choose your starter moment, and here it looks like we're seeing the placeholders for Bianca and Cheren. And the build also featured our earliest look at the Unova region map. By this point, Game Freak had built out a significant portion of Unova. In fact, this is the first build I could find where the main area of Castelia City is fully textured. I really like how this earlier Castelia street looks. The Sky Arrow bridge level was basically complete at this point too, along with all of the cinematic camera angles from the final version. Here's just some miscellaneous gameplay footage from around Unova. It's clear that by now, a lot had been completed. I also noticed more variety in the wild Pokemon encounters. Striaton City had pretty much all of its final textures, and Game Freak had started populating the buildings with specific hand-picked NPCs. The development of Heart Gold and Soul Silver was wrapping up around this time, and you can really feel the momentum shift. By mid-2009, Black and White became a top priority, and more developers were clearly being assigned to the project, and the difference in pace and polish is noticeable. During this development ramp-up, we get the August 17th build. If you've seen the Black and White deep dive, you might remember that we discussed a scrap design for the Castelia City Pokemon Center, one with dual entrances, and clearly inspired by Nintendo New York. In that video we speculated whether or not the interior was different too, and the answer is yes. It featured a completely unique layout, exclusive to this version of a Pokemon Center. The design of course includes the dual entrance, but also the healing area was shifted to the left, which is very odd. I don't think we've ever seen a Pokemon Center from this angle. The Pokemon remains in its usual spot. We have a PC right in front of the entrance. Honestly, if you take the left entrance, this is the most convenient Pokemon Center layout ever designed. But judging by the placement of the PCs up top, and the healing station, I can't help but wonder if the original plan was to have dynamic camera angles that change as you get closer to each entrance. The inner part of Castelia City went through multiple revisions during this time. Also notably, the battle UI was finalized well over a year before release. Aside from a map progress, you can also see that Game Freak began scripting NPC behavior, making them interactable, giving them movement patterns, and overall bringing the world of Unova to life. By October 13th, Game Freak had begun implementing the story events directly into the game. The game was actually playable up to a decent point in the early story, even though it still used placeholder sprites and graphics to represent characters and elements that hadn't been fully added yet. I like the camera control in this build, especially having a wide range of fixed angles. Then by October 29th, we get the first build that includes Hilbert's Overworld sprite, and here's some of the early designs for the starters. The game was really starting to come together at this point. This was also shortly after Heart Gold and Soul Silver released in Japan, meaning Black and White became Game Freak's main focus, and huge progress was being made every day. By December 1st, Castelia City was still going through revisions. The dual entrance Pokemon Center was still present in this build, now with an updated and more polished layout. Unfortunately, this was also the last time we ever saw the dual entrance Pokemon Center. The game started showing more and more polish throughout December. You can see it's really starting to look like the final game. Gyms were now featuring puzzles, and tons of events were scripted out. Graphics massively improved in the span of mere days. December 15th saw the extended prototype opening cutscene, along with a brief appearance of an unused, rumored mythical Pokemon design. There was also a beta title screen featuring Zekrom perched on Sky Arrow Bridge, which is a pretty cool visual. Accumula Town's layout was finalized, and the Team Plasma cutscene was now implemented. Strangely, Lucas and Dawn sprites were still present, and interacting with this one random NPC would trigger a slowed down Dialga cry. Then by Christmas Day, Bianca finally received her Overworld sprite. The Unova map UI had also been finalized, and I believe the Elite Four battles were slightly different compared to the final version. Rolling into January 4th, 2010, Game Freak had compiled all of the beta Unovan Pokemon sprites. Many of them had very different designs from the final versions, and there's even a few unused sprites that never made it into the game. Early 2010 marked the final stretch of development for Black and White. By this point, most of the game's core content had been completed. It's likely that the team aimed to wrap up development by mid-2010 to shift focus towards bug testing, optimization, and localization. By the end of April, the game was essentially complete. Surprisingly, the only major component still missing from this build was the fully animated battle sprites for every Pokemon, which means one of Generation 5's most iconic features, the animated sprites, was one of the very last things fully added, a detail that's now widely celebrated, and often cited as a key reason why many fans consider Black and White the peak of 2D Pokemon. It just goes to show that even in the latest stages of game development, even though you've created an amazing game, you can still add something that reshapes the legacy of the game forever. And with that, we've officially covered the full development timeline of Pokemon Black and White. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.